Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified, declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 28th of December in the last week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then give the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is December 28th, and this program is a review of the year. Not the year 2012, but the year 2013. We want to get a jump on this, you know. It would have probably been a good idea if I had informed my colleagues of what I had planned for this program. But then again, it sort of falls in with the plan. Since we don't know what's going to happen, we can move into it with a certain panache. So a review of 2013 with the understanding that the issue is dependent upon what we know about the present. The medical profession distinguishes between prognosis, saying what's going to happen with the disease, and diagnosis, an account, an analysis of what the disease actually is. And difficult as prognosis in medicine or in society can be, it's obvious that a good prognosis depends upon a good diagnosis. In other words, if you get the analysis wrong, you can be right about the prognosis only by accident. Even if you get the diagnosis right, you still may be wildly off in the prognosis, of course, but you can't do it at all. You can't, except by accident, unless you get the analysis right. Our notion then is that we can give you a review of 2013 based on an analysis, a diagnosis of what has occurred to the moment. I looked around for a third word in that pairing, prognosis and diagnosis, a word, they're both based on the Greek word for knowledge, gnosis. I needed a word that talked about knowledge of the past, in other words, that would give us the analysis that would allow us to proceed into the future. And I found to my surprise the Greeks really didn't have one, at least not on that same route. That if you talked about gnosis, knowledge, and wanted knowledge of the past, retro knowledge, as Ron suggested, or the backstory, the best you could do in Greek, or best I could do in Greek, was pizognosis. And that had several suggestions that perhaps were worthwhile. But then I suddenly realized the reason the Greeks didn't have a word for it is that they'd already invented one long before, and the word they invented was history. It was history that we would need that would be our guide to what is to come. So today is our review of the future, a pizognosis, a review of the future, a review of the year to come, 2013, and it's an attempt to try to talk about the situation that exists right now as a basis for understanding how we might suggest what 2013 will hold. Now remember, the analysis that we've been presenting to you here on News from Neptune depends upon the fact that the analysis you've been getting from our government and therefore from our media is full of lies. On the crucial issues, war and the economy, the government is consistently lying to us. They say the war is winding down when it's obviously not. They say the economy is improving when in fact the government is working for that 1% that has been part of 30 years of neoliberalism, which is at its heart an attempt to destroy the welfare state. And our present American government is working for that tiny fragment of the population, not for the majority, when the attempt to destroy the welfare state is well underway. It's called austerity in Europe. It's called entitlement reform in the United States, and the present administration is down with the program, as they say. We'll perhaps expand on this point. I spent some time last night reading future history novels that were quite popular at the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, about what the 20th century would be like. Well, we have a somewhat smaller task. We only have to talk about 1 year. But we will present a review of the year, the review of 2013, not 2012, and Ron Szoke will have the first look back at 2013.
Okay, in this holiday season, since we're all a little frazzled, I'm not sure there'll be much pizzazz in my panache, but
or in your piezo history.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Don't have much frisson in what I'm doing today, but anyway, I wanted to raise a number of points, which will primarily be extrapolations from the recent past, of course, which is always the most fallacious thing you can do about talking about the future and what will happen then, and so on. So the main item in the news, of course, being that we are staring into the financial abyss. And as someone has said, maybe the abyss is staring into us. But in any case, I wanted to raise a couple of points about what's happening economically. Interesting review, December 10th, of a recent book by Chrystia Freeland called Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else. A couple of interesting sentences from it. In Freeland's view, it's not individual plutocrats who should be held accountable for rising inequality. For the most part, they've been in the right place at the right time to capitalize on larger economic forces and public policy decisions that have enabled the very rich to tilt the rules of the game in their favor. Much of the story of the rise of the 1%, and especially the 1/10 of 1%, Freeland writes, is the story of the rise of finance. As Plutocrats explains, the extreme wealth of America's top financiers is a cautionary tale of so-called rent-seeking, an economic term describing enrichment through reallocation rather than the creation of wealth. So people are passing around certificates of ownership and counting this as economic activity. Freeland argues that this is the most worrisome aspect of the rise of the plutocrats, that America, along a land of economic opportunity, will increasingly veer toward oligarchy with avenues for advancement shut off by elites who are determined to maintain their hold in power and tempted to pull up the ladder they climbed to the top. So they're kicking it away after them. An aspect of this is what's happening in higher education. People are always full of opinions about that. A couple more threads or straws in the wind. More Illinois students going to Missouri. Is this a trend? I don't know. The University of Missouri at Columbia. I don't know whether it's just because it's easier to get into.
Better basketball team.
Yeah, or it costs less or what. But apparently this has the beginnings of a trend. Freshman enrollment at the University of Missouri's flagship campus included 1,370 from Illinois, a record 21% of the class. So why are they going there? Who knows? Another story in the New York Times on December 22nd, for many poor students, the leap to college ends in a hard fall. It has examples here, a couple of Hispanic girls. Angelica Gonzalez marched through high school in goth armor, black boots, chains, and cargo pants, but undermined her pose of alienation with a place on the honor roll. She nicknamed herself after a metal band, excuse me, and vowed to become the first in her family to earn a college degree. I don't want to work at Walmart like her mother, she wrote to a school counselor. Weekends and summers were devoted to a college readiness program where her best friends, Melissa O'Neill and Bianca Gonzalez, shared her drive to get off the island, escape the prospect of dead-end lives in luckless Galveston, Texas. Melissa, an 8th grade valedictorian, seethed over her mother's boyfriends and drinking, and Bianca's bubbly innocence had the trauma of her father's death. They stuck together so much that a tutor called them the triplets. Anyway, she did not finish college and is now doing a very low-level clerical job. And the stories about what happened and all of the mishaps and circumstances along the way that kept them from graduating. So now they are without a degree, even though they prove that they have a great deal of academic talent, intelligence, and application to the tests that they're doing. So that's unfortunate. We could talk about that, or a very strange story that appeared in USA Today about the people in Mexico who are opposing changes in education. Rural Mexicans opposing attempts to modernize, which seems like a very self-defeating thing to do, but they are opposing computer training, for example, and other things that would bring them into the global economy. These are called normalistas, and it's an outgrowth of the normal school movement. After the Napoleonic Wars in France, there were many colleges or higher education organizations started to train school teachers, and they were called École Normale, the normal schools. We even had one here that I attended for a while, Illinois State Normal University, as it was known at the time, now just Illinois State University. And what accounts for this? It seems to me, very regressive move on the part of these people, and I'll stop that thread there.
Thank you, Ron. Fascinating stuff. David, would you by any chance have thoughts about higher education and as we review 2013?
Yeah, I might have a few.
I thought you might.
I guess as you were mentioning Galveston, I was thinking about the natural disaster that occurred there. I guess about 100 years ago. Was that in the early 1900s that there was?
Was it 1938 or is that
or
the earlier
not,
one?
Not
or
that
is
long
an earlier
ago.
one? Yeah.
Okay, so not 100 years ago, but 75 years ago. And it seems to me that referring to the New York Times article, which Ron mentioned, which presented the plight of these 3 young women who aspire to use education as an opportunity to make more money than their parents make, and that this is the consequences of this are often presented as a kind of natural, as sort of the very specific social context and the choices, the political choices that are involved in those contexts are presented as natural, that these things, these women make these choices and they're understandable choices, but there's just a natural process by which they get into debt and can't afford to finish college, or even if they do finish college, have much debt and can't find jobs that are adequately paying enough to lead a middle-class lifestyle, especially including paying off debt. But these, of course, aren't natural phenomenon. These are phenomena that are very much part of our educational and higher educational environment for the last 30 or 40 years. And I'm reading a very interesting book, which I'll mention now, about the role that attempts to debunk the notion of educational opportunity or equal opportunity. And that is, and it's a relatively obscure book, so it needs whatever little promotion it might get. It's called Class Dismissed, which is a pun on the word social class, and it's by a guy named John Marsh, and it's published by Monthly Review Press, and it really gives a very good and serviceable overview of how educational opportunity became the primary means which we talk about economic inequality and poverty and so forth, and how to alleviate those things, or at least address those problems in our country, and how misguided, as I've mentioned many times on this show, and as he deals with thoroughly in the background for this book. So there will be more about this in shows to come. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think the book goes quite far enough in describing the agenda, the kind of class warfare, the sort of explicit class warfare that's involved in what's happened to education and higher ed in this country over the last 30 or 40 years. But I think that's a small quibble with the book overall. And one interesting footnote is that one of the blurbs of the book, and one of the, I think, the inspirations of the book, is by a fellow that we've mentioned often on this program, Walter Ben Michaels at the University of Illinois Chicago. And in fact, John Marsh, the author of this book, was formerly a student here and began to think about these issues as a graduate student here. And interestingly, not as a graduate student here in the economics department or in the education department, although there's plenty about both the economy and education in this book. He's a literary scholar. So like Walter Ben Michaels, who is also a literary scholar, for some reason we're having to rely on these people who are not who sort of go into examine other disciplines. So that's my response, that's my comment in regard to the higher ed issue.
Yeah, I faintly recall a classic article about the school as a sorting and selecting mechanism, and it's been difficult to overcome that function, that implicit or latent function, despite all the talk about equal opportunity and what the schools are supposed to do in providing that. A couple of more sentences from this article. The story of these three young women's lost footing is also the story of something larger, the growing role that education plays in preserving class divisions. Poor students have long trailed affluent peers in school performance, but from grade school tests to college completion, the gaps are growing. With school success and earning prospects ever more entwined, the consequences carry far. Education, a force meant to erode class barriers, appears to be fortifying them. Everyone wants to think of education as an equalizer, the place where upward mobility gets started, said Greg Duncan, an economist at the University of California, Irvine. But on virtually every measure we have, the gaps between high and low-income kids are widening. It's very disheartening. The growing role of class in academic success has taken experts by surprise, since it follows decades of equal opportunity efforts and counters racial trends where differences have narrowed. It adds to fears over recent evidence suggesting that low-income Americans have lower chances for upward mobility than counterparts in Canada and Western Europe, which will be unbelievable to a lot of people who think that the USA is the land of opportunity, where if you work hard, you can get ahead and achieve the American dream. But more and more people are seeing that that's completely hollow.
The important reflections that both of you offer on the situation of contemporary education reminds me of the remark attributed to George Orwell that I have searched for in Orwell's works and never found, which itself is a sort of an example almost of the remark itself. Orwell is supposed to have said that we all assume the external social world will remain more or less the same. We think we can do a review of 2013 because in our heart of hearts we think 2013 is finally going to be pretty much like like 2012. The only problem is people have lied about what 2012 was or have misunderstood what 2012 was. But we're here to tell you we know what 2012 was, and therefore we can tell you what 2013 is going to be like. Now, this depends upon Orwell's notion that we assume the external world is going to remain essentially the same, but we are free to change ourselves, you know, reinvent ourselves, reform ourselves at any moment. Orwell says probably just the opposite is the case. And it seems to me that the reflection on the Academy, perhaps particularly for the three of us, underlines and illustrates his point. We are of an age to have come into the American university system, go to college and to graduate school, with an assumption of what that world was like that we assumed was perennial. It probably stretched back to the medieval university. Thomas Aquinas would probably recognize what we were doing in the 13th century, and the universities were like that. And that those of us who came out of college saying, hey, this looks like a pretty good gig, I'm going to go get a doctorate, or I'm going to go get a higher degree, or I'm going to go work in education and so forth, because, hey, that's not going to change. We were the more deceived. Because, in fact, the university systems that existed in my adult life, and that I spent what I laughingly refer to as my career in, is a hothouse plant. And it's a hothouse plant for a particular time. It sprang to life almost fully armed from the GI Bill. And it produced a system of higher education, particularly in the arts, that had this permanency to it, but in fact declined rapidly and has changed more in the last 10 years, in the first 10 years of the 21st century, than it has since the time of the GI Bill and the post-World War II sense. Carrie Nelson, who's head of a member of the faculty at the University of Illinois and head of the AAUP for a while, pointed out a number of years ago that the university system in which he was bred up was changing irrevocably and would not exist in the same force. And when I heard him say that, I said, you know, surely he's, you know, being alarmist. It's not going to change that much. Hence, see George Orwell above. In fact, it has already changed that much, and not just because of the economic crisis of a couple of years ago. It's changed for one essential reason, I think, in America, and to some extent, mutatis mutandis in Britain. That's because the academy, the academic world that I thought looked so nice when I decided that I would move into it as a career, that academic world is bound up with the welfare state. And that what we have seen in the last several years is the triumph of the campaign against the welfare state, which hasn't even had a name until fairly recently, but is, if it needs a name, it's called neoliberalism. The triumph against the welfare state is also the campaign against the welfare state by neoliberalism is also a campaign against the university, and it has irrevocably changed it already from that hothouse plant of the GI Bill. It's being disassembled as we speak. The PhD programs that I moved into when I got out of college will never exist in that form again, or at least they won't exist in that form very soon. And we have a situation right now in which the economic transformations produced by neoliberalism, most notable in the vast and accelerating increase in inequality in this country, is going to produce that. I should have known. I should have seen it. When I went to college in the 60s, there was an egalitarian sense at that college that reflected the fact that equality, and I'm talking just about possession of money, wealth, equality of wealth, was greater in the late 60s than it had been any time since the beginning of the Great Depression or any time since. And that was the world that I went to school in. That was the welfare state world and the academic world I went to. When my kids went to that same college a generation later, something very strange had happened. A sense of inequality was growing and burgeoning among them. I have kids just old enough to have, at 10-year removes, go to that same college. It was more unequal in my son's time, even more unequal in my daughter's time. Now, everyone thinks that the progress is going, or that the change is going in the other direction. It's not. What was happening here was that peculiar growth of the American Academy of the 60s was being disassembled. And we were warned. In 1975, the Trilateral Commission published a group called The Crisis of Democracy. And the crisis was that too much democracy was getting around, and it was showing up particularly in higher education. That's why we're having all these troubles with these colleges, the anti-Vietnam War movement, for example, in colleges in this country and abroad. Well, the people from outside, from Carrie Nelson to the Trilateral Commission, knew much better what was going on than those of us who were in the midst of that world, and it's now come to fruition, and it's not separate from the societal transformations that bring us austerity and entitlement reform. So as we look back on 2013 and review the wreckage of higher education, we can understand that it's not an isolated or peculiar event. It has to do with that economic transformation that neoliberalism has been planning for a generation and has succeeded at in our own time. You buy this? Do you buy this, guys?
Yeah. Well, would you consider that a part of the trend that's called the corporatization of the university?
Or I would say the corporatization of the university in that sense was a response to this, to this sort of pressure. I mean, remember, we mentioned before the university structure against which the 60s revolt took place, most visibly perhaps in California, the multiversity of Clark
Kerr.
Clark Kerr.
The comprehensive university.
Yeah. And that was consciously understood as being incorporated with the expanding and burgeoning American economy, which included the welfare state aspects, so that California particularly was generating campuses so that all these new people could be accommodated in this corporate academic world. Well, it ran into certain troubles along the way, including objections from the people it was supposedly, in whose interest it was supposedly constructed. Mario Savio's famous speech about the machine that he thought it was necessary to stop was onto something, however poetically.
There began to be a lot of complaints from Lionel Trilling and others of that ilk about the adversary culture that was based in the universities and so on.
The adversary culture, what he's objecting to, in other words, was criticism of this very tradition that was.
What one name I'd like to throw into this conversation is that of unfortunately, a late historian named David Noble, N-O-B-L-E, who was a colleague of Noam Chomsky at MIT back in the 70s. He was actually perhaps a colleague of yours, Carl's, at Rochester, because I know he was. He published his first book on the basis of a dissertation that he wrote under Christopher Lasch at Rochester. But in any event, I just want to throw his name in there. And the reason I do that is because I've just started to read more seriously some of his work, because I think it relates so strongly to these issues, this critique of the manner in which technology has evolved and been used in the workplace and its relationship to the educational workplace, so to speak, and I think what it points out also is that there's an underlying. I think when we see the 70s as a backlash against some of the things that have been of some of the progress that had been made in the 50s and 60s, we also might forget to look at the underlying continuity of the way capitalism worked and the way it always worked. I think when we look at the unions and the rise of unions, we need to see what the problems were with the rise of an AFL-CIO that was pretty much consistent with American foreign policy. And in education, while seeing some of the opening up of opportunity and some of the egalitarian aspects, we can also, as Carl points out in University of California and Clark Kerr and the whole idea of the kind of the managerial society, that never really went away. The 60s rebelled against that, but the underlying aspects, as Noble points out in his work, the manner in which technology was to be used to continue to dumb down work, basically, continue to make sure that work didn't exist, you know, as Noam Chomsky talks about in an interview just a couple of days ago on the ZNet website, that it's very important to the way capitalism has always worked that work not be seen as meaningful and not be seen as something of choice. And I don't think education, I think some of the liberatory aspects of education as came to be publicized by people like Paul Goodman and others in the 50s and 60s certainly had their audience and rang true to some things about that era. But underlying that, the system that Mario Savio and other people rebelled against remained in place. And in spite of all the kerfuffle from 62 or 64 to 74, 75 or 76, those underlying elements remained there and came back in full force since then.
I think that's very true. David Noble, whom you mentioned, is very much worth remembering. He'd come and gone to Rochester before I arrived there for a brief stint, and was denied. He was denied tenure at MIT, where he was indeed Chomsky's colleague. But his mentor, Kit Lash, was a friend of mine. I was very pleased to have known Lash in some later years at Rochester, and Lash's own book, The Culture of Narcissism, has a very 70s character to it, but one of the things, I mean in the sense that he was talking about that particular era, but one of the things he was onto it was the sort of transformation that was taking place here, which he examined in terms of its psychological sources and effects rather than its directly economic, although he by no means denied them.
Yeah.
Now we see a little more clearly how they were bound up with the economy, which Kit certainly understood and talked about, but most of his listeners, I think, didn't hear him on that point. But the mention of Noble is extremely worthwhile. I first encountered David Noble in his work on automation, where we all assumed that the industrial economy as it existed in the late 20th century had a sort of naturalness to it. What we were in effect, whether we considered ourselves leftists or rightists or whatever, we were some form of technological determinist. We just assumed that technology meant that you had to do things that way. And what David came along to say was that, look, the entire automation, if you like, of American industry is not necessary, but it's political. That it has been chosen specifically to separate classes, to keep managerial knowledge and so forth in place, and deny the workers the perfectly possible ability to run their own factories. Because if the workers get the idea they could run their own factories, why, who knows where it might end. So his point was that this was not just a natural procedure, the automation of the industrialization of American economy. It was not just a natural procedure, it was a political procedure, and it was worth talking about how we wanted to arrange it politically. What our rulers didn't want us to do, what we would now call the 1%, is realize that these things were malleable, that these things could be changed, that we could rearrange the organization of how we obtain our food, clothing, and shelter, and do it in such a way that did not divide classes as the modern industrial economy did. Very important work, and it's a great shame that it's gone down the memory hole. It would be quite worthwhile, I think, to revive both Christopher Lash and David Noble's work.
Do you see something good coming out of the recent trend to offer higher education courses on the internet, the massive courses that you can sign up for free, and maybe you can get some credit also if you pass the exam at the end, and so on? Is this technology going to make opportunity more equal because everyone will have access to it?
That's a good question. I wonder what your take is on that, David.
Yes
What
and
put
no.
me in mind. Yes, yeah, exactly.
A firm yes and no.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right, right.
It puts me in mind, there was a great sort of free school movement associated with the 60s, including contemporaries of mine and people involved in the Berkeley events and so forth, that said, well, fine, we'll just do what the universities do. We'll just move out across the street and to an empty factory and do it. Well, we now have a technological take on that. We'll just do it on the internet rather than in the empty factory across the street. But it's still the same sort of free school movement. People pointed out there that was all very nice. You could go across the street and teach exactly the same things, but your degrees weren't accredited.
Right.
Suddenly we realized there was an accreditation issue, that the American university system worked on a licensing form.
Well, credentialing, yes.
Yes,
Distributing
well, but not even credentialing exactly, because you could have the credential in the sense that you could do the stuff. You could talk about medieval history or electrical engineering or what have you, but if you didn't have the degree, so credential in that sense, yes, exactly, that was the issue. And it isn't the present internet version of this system confronted with the same issue?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
to me, credentials mean a certificate or
Okay.
a transcript of all the courses you've taken and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think these things are great for people who don't have to worry about what the payoff is, who aren't concerned about the practical consequences or what it can get them. They can be a great access to some kinds of learning, but they're still being done in a context in which they're being marketed. They're kind of a part of the brand. I read in a job description recently that one of the roles of this person being hired at our local college was going to be to develop the University of Illinois brand or market the University of Illinois brand. And really, it's that this is what going back to your the concern you first raised, there's this impetus towards the marketing of this contradictory idea that education is being marketed when the purpose of learning should not be. It can be of a practical nature, but I'm looking for a word here that I can't see, but as long as it's seen in this context of what's the pay, or human capital, I guess, is one way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the old controversy over education versus training.
Yes.
And some have been saying that the universities should simply acquiesce in the notion that they're training professionals for employment by the corporations.
Well, we're certainly going that way, I think, with a rapidity that I would not have credited a couple of years ago. I mean, it's quite astonishing to me. I mean, as we listen to universities across the country start saying, well, we can get rid of these PhD programs and save money, and the programs they're getting rid of are programs in what we used to call the liberal arts. We remember liberal arts, the notion comes from the idea of things that are appropriate for a free person, liberal in that sense. The liberal arts are things that were supposedly the crowning glory of the university system, and that's what's being thrown out the door these days, saying, okay, but we can train you in everything from animal husbandry to electronics, but don't come talking to us about history or physiognosis. Come talk to us about things that we can use.
Well, there was some concern, I think, that liberal education might turn some people into liberals.
Well, consummation devoutly to be wished, I'm not sure. And indeed, that's what the quote, the 60s were about in American universities in some way. There's another aspect of this, too, and that is the whole financing of university education, which in recent years has, as part of the neoliberal program, become more and more difficult for people of modest means. Yes. I mean, it's not finally necessary to be independently wealthy to go to university as it was in parts of the American 19th century, but it certainly helps. I mean, the point was made, in fact, by our friend Doug Henwood of the Left Business Observer, and picked up by Noam Chomsky fairly recently, that if you look at the numbers overall, there's no reason, none, zero reason, why higher education, that is university, graduate schools, shouldn't be free in this country. You can do it with the actual outlay, although the universities themselves keep pleading poverty, the actual outlay to do that would be minimal and certainly absorbed within the present educational budget. Do you buy that? Are Noam and Doug right there?
I would think
David?
so. I mean, there'd be lots of ways to fund that in terms of doing war less and all that stuff. I mean, it's one of the many things that could be much more lavishly or adequately funded than it is now, given our military system and our broken and too expensive healthcare system.
But this is to apply David Noble in some sense to the university. I mean, this is the way we've got to do it in the university. We've got to charge people these tuition and so forth because it's so expensive. In fact, it's rather a social and political choice that the university should be limited in this way to training, as Ron was suggesting, or the private preserve only of wealthy aesthetes who won't actually go take the arts courses.
Well, mandarins, yeah.
Yes.
And that's the perversion of education, is training or credentialing a mandarin. But yeah, do we need more technicians? Well, we certainly do, I guess, for the most part. But is that all we need?
We've got to run those drones, eh?
Yeah, right.
You mentioned Paul Goodman earlier, someone I hadn't thought of in years. But his book, the book that must have come out in the early '60s itself, called Compulsory Miseducation, in which he talked about these sort of social forces forming education. People thought they went off to college to pick out something they'd like to do for a career and so forth. Instead, a program was being worked on it, and indeed there was worked on them. And the great example of that in those days was General Hershey's channeling memo during the Vietnam War, where he said, yes, we should exempt some students at least from the draft, so long as they're learning something useful for the American economy, so long as they can be channeled into the sorts of things they should be doing. Yes, they shouldn't be drafted into the Army. And that memo, which was scandalous enough when it was revealed in the early 60s, was a practical example of Goodman's compulsory miseducation.
His earlier book was somewhat more popular, I think, at the time, Growing Up Absurd, which was...
perhaps that's the one I'm thinking of, is it? Because
I'm
that
not
was
sure which. Yeah, I'm not sure which.
He was the same thesis, basically.
Yeah, right.
Do we have, I look at the clock on the wall, such as it is, virtual, as it is here, and realize we have to turn to Coburn's Corner if we're going to get it in.
Yes.
Do you gentlemen have some samples for Coburn's Corner?
Oh, yes, yes.
Coburn's Corner is a new department we have added to News from Neptune in honor of the late Alexander Coburn. The corner has an edge on it because it's based on his little pamphlet Guillotined, in which he suggested language which hid its political purpose or had outlived its usefulness. Not simply cliches, but dangerous cliches, cliches that got in the way of our understanding politics. And in some sense, we've been talking about that all day today. But I think we have some particular examples. Ron, you say you have some candidates for Coburn's Corner?
Yeah, my nomination this time is leverage. We're hearing a lot of talk about leverage. Gun makers use home leverage in Connecticut to get exemption from gun control laws and so on. They say, if you pass such a law in Connecticut, we'll move out, because a number of the big gun makers are based in Connecticut, apparently. And
does that mean the local sandwich maker has leverage in Champaign?
Yeah, well, that's what it actually brought to mind. And a number of other people are starting to talk that way. Who was it? Senator Grassley now saying we have leverage with Obama and so on. So that means, what that apparently means is that we won't vote to raise the debt limit unless he does what we want him to do.
What do they call that on The Sopranos? Juice?
Yeah, right.
Juice?
Yeah. Well, yeah, incentive, giving them an incentive, it's called.
Making an offer they can't refuse.
Yeah,
in
it's
the old
also
Godfather picture.
Yeah, known in some cases as blackmail or extortion.
David, you have a candidate for the corner?
Well, I've sort of had one in the hopper for a few weeks that I haven't been able to get in.
Yeah, we get to the corner late.
But usually my words are taken from reading the New York Times and words that I feel come to sort of symbolize a sort of New York Times speak. And I'm not sure if they're used as commonly in other venues, but the word fraught has been used increasingly.
Oh, I like that.
And when I sort of Googled that, I didn't get very far in researching it, and I don't have a sort of a hit count on how often this is used. But my sense over the years is that the word fraught has become increasingly used in this sort of urbane context, and that one commenter pointed out that the word fraught stopped having a prepositional phrase attached to it at some point. In other words, it used to be that something was fraught with something, but that now things are just fraught. And relationships are fraught, or issues are fraught. They may still be fraught with something or other, but that somehow they're conveying some sort of sense, to me anyway, I'll take a poke at this, what the underlying thing going on here is that they're trying to convey something that a conflict, a sort of irresolvable conflict, or again, something sort of natural that it just sort of happens, and that we can't really do anything about, but we can certainly be fraught. And as in so many things with the New York Times, it's kind of a way of avoiding going deeper into an issue and finding out, well, what is really going on with this conflict, or what is really, why has the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela become fraught? I'm not sure that particular word has been used in that context, but it might just as easily
sure
be.
It is. Now, cinnamon, yes. Jeez. Christmas cheer, guys.
Yeah.
A synonym for fraught would then be loaded, which has several overtones that works here. You can say the question is fraught with significance for the relationships with Venezuela, but the question is loaded, such as have you stopped beating your wife? And fraught is useful in this regard, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like a code word for something where there's an issue involved, a hot button issue that
you don't want to mention.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Fraught, I mean, it's basically freighted, isn't it? I mean, it carries
exactly.
Okay, fraught, loaded,
Is
freighted.
our relationship with Israel fraught?
Oh, that's very fraught.
Extremely fraught. Right.
And the word, in relation to that, I'm glad you brought that up, Ron, of course, but the word anguish is probably used in relation to Israel and the way Israelis feel more often than it is used in any other context.
Yeah.
And that's become very characteristic of the way that the Israel-Palestine conflict, and in certain issues within Israel relating to the Holocaust and other aspects, Israelis apparently feel anguish to a much greater level than other cultures, or one would think so if one read the New York Times consistently over the last 20 or 30 years.
Oh, they're so emotional, right?
They're anguished because their situation is so fraught, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Another one, interesting one, is define.
Is what?
One candidate defines another one. Has anyone defined you in the mass media? Are you going to define me?
Find or defined?
Define.
Yes.
It's being used in a peculiar way.
My candidate...
Sort of frame is what you mean.
Yeah, right.
Like loaded. A lot of these seem to be tending, gentlemen, in a certain direction here. My candidate is harsh. as in harsh techniques.
Oh, yeah.
It means torture.
Right.
And I led to this particularly with reference to a movie. And that is this Zero Dark 30 film done by this director, Catherine Bigelow, who made The Hurt Locker. And that is just, once again, who could have imagined that a big budget Hollywood movie would turn into a propaganda piece for torture, which is what this is. The film is about the murder, the assassination of Osama bin Laden, very far from any notion of due process, of course, which in this administration means the Attorney General thinks about something. That's counted as due process. The harsh techniques that are being justified and are presented as in the movie as the necessary prolegomena to the noble elimination of Osama bin Laden, which in fact was a great crime, multiply violating international law. The harsh techniques are being advertised in this film, and the film is being defended by its makers and by a good number of pundits as saying, hey, it's just a movie. And B, well, people need to know sort of these things. It probably was necessary to use torture techniques.
Saved American lives.
Yeah, there we are. But there's hypocrisy being the tribute that vice pays to virtue. We should realize that instead of the movie being presented as a defense of torture, as it is in so many words, it's rather presented as a defense of harsh interrogation techniques.
I thought they were called aggressive interrogation.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, but certainly, I mean, torture is bad. We don't want to do torture.
Right.
But it's obviously necessary, as you say, to save lives, to use harsh and aggressive techniques occasionally, just occasionally.
Yeah,
we just have to do it
never
every now
been
and then.
shown that it actually has ever saved any lives.
Well,
but
the
some
movie
claims are made,
the movie says this. I mean, the movie sets out something that even the CIA has had to step forward and object to, the notion that harsh techniques were what delivered Osama bin Laden into the hands of the Obama administration.
Yeah.
So, my candidate, harsh.
Can I say a couple of things about the year of 2013?
Yes,
we're at
what a
the
good.
end-
That's what
since
the
we're
end.
at the end.
We're at the end
yeah,
of our review of 2013.
Just a couple of brief comments. First of all, the Illini had a terrible football season. The Cubs.
Now you're talking about 2012 or 2013?
No, 2013.
Okay, got it.
That was the idea, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Sorry.
The Illini have a terrible football team. It's still getting worse, and they've had to fire their coach and pay another coach $1 gazillion to have
exactly.
a terrible football team next year. The Cubs haven't won the World Series, no surprise there. And Chuck Hagel has been Secretary of Defense for almost a year now, and our foreign policy is exactly the same as it was at the beginning of 2013. And more about that next week.
Yes, these are important reflections and very, very worthwhile indeed. I think if we talk about the great issues of the day in terms of war and economy, we have to say that 2013 reveals to us once again, if we want to look closely, that the administration continues to lie about its wars in the Middle East, which themselves continue, and the reason for the war continues. That is the imperial efforts of the American government, going back to the Second World War, are being followed by this administration, although it got elected by convincing people that it wouldn't. And on the economy, the neoliberal program, which also runs back almost as far, but as a successful program runs back now a generation, is being followed by this administration, even though they say they said they wouldn't. We'll protect Social Security, unlike those bad guys on the Republican side who do terrible things to Social Security if they get in.
Yeah.
The administration got back in and proceeded to do terrible things to Social Security, as we have seen here at the end of 2013. So, any summary judgments from you,
No,
Ron?
I predict that
on
a
the
year from now, this is my prophecy, we'll be back here discussing much the same thing, in much the same way, because of the enormous momentum of these institutions and organizations. And we must increase the level of resistance.
The only hopeful thing I see in that is the notion that we'll be back here.
Yeah,
We all need a future.
yeah, right.
You have been watching News from Neptune. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky, and this has been the Review of the Year edition, but the year was 2013, not 2012. If our program interested you, you might want to look at similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but also streaming online. Go to urbanapublictelevision.org and look for the button for the streaming. Tomorrow and Saturday at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a rebroadcast of this program, News from Neptune. At 3 p.m., the Populist Dialogues. On Sunday, is this close enough to write, Jason? Am I close enough to? Yes, good. All right. On Sunday at 7 a.m., the White House Chronicle. At 3:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogues rebroadcast, and at 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with our friends David Johnson and Jim Iman. Weekdays, Monday through Friday at 7 a.m., Democracy Now. At 8 a.m., The Big Picture. At noon, the David Pakman Show. And Monday, I think this is still true even over the holiday, Tom Hartman Show, the live call-in program from 2 to 5 p.m. on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday at 10 p.m., We're on the Air, and which you might see some familiar faces. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.